In this video, it's my pleasure to be doing an interview with Wilcox Snellings. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoy this video. Please like and subscribe, and you'll be notified every time I upload a new video. Please let me know what you think in the comments below and what you'd like to see in future videos, and I'll work on that. If you happen to know Wilcox and want to share anything, please do so in the comments. So for most of the people that are watching this video, Wilcox Snellings needs no introduction, but for those who are not familiar with him, in terms of introduction, Wilcox is one of the best backgammon players of all time. He was named on the Backgammon Giant list 7 times. He was #1 twice, and he should have been a third time, but someone left him off the ballot, I think accidentally. But that was in the 90s, I believe. He's recently come back and started playing again, and currently the #7 giant. He is a grandmaster level player. He's won multiple championships and also second place finishes around the world, including Monte Carlo, Super Jackpot, Las Vegas, Reno, Addison, Texas, Dallas, Texas, Bahamas, several Masters events. He's been in the final 8 of the World Championships 3 times, and that's remarkable. He's had 11 second place finishes in main events and Masters, and he's only played 50 total major events. So all those accomplishments in just that few number of events is really remarkable. A lot of people do that they play 50 events in an entire year, and they don't do that. He's also a frequent expert contributor to a number of the online backgammon forums. It's a pleasure to have Wilcox Snellings. Thank you for joining me, and welcome.
Thanks, Alex. I appreciate the offer to talk a little bit more about my life and my love of backgammon.
Yeah, I'm delighted to have you. Uh, you were probably one of the top people that people were asking about to have on an interview. So how are you doing today?
Great, thank you.
Good, good. And you're in Costa Rica, correct?
That's right. Yeah, I've lived here now 16 years, and this is where I met my wife almost 30 years ago.
Okay, well, we'll talk about that shortly. I'd like to start a little bit with a little bit of background biographical information, if I may. So let's start with please tell us where you were born and raised in terms of, education, high school, college, things like that.
Sure. So I was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and a lot of my family, most of my family really still live in the state in various ports, whether it be New Orleans or most of them in Monroe, Louisiana, in the northeast part of the state. My parents got divorced when I was 4, and so I moved up to New York City with my mother, and so spent most of my life in New York, although I spent a couple of months in Monroe every year. And so I had this very interesting childhood because my relatives were all like, highly educated, interesting people, but the ones in Monroe, of course, lived in a very rural part of the country, and between accents and lifestyles and everything else, it was quite different from my New York City experience, as you might imagine, and the liberal versus conservative and just many things. It was I think I learned a lot by making these sort of adjustments going back and forth. And as far as education went, I went to school in New York City. Fortunately, was able to go to a very good private school there, and I went on to University of Virginia for college, where I completed basically 2.5 years before backgammon kind of seduced me away. And yeah, so that's a glimpse.
Good. And now I understand you're married with children and grandchildren.
Yeah, we have our first grandson. So my wife and I got married 26 years ago, And we have our son is now, our daughter, we'll start with our daughter is 38 and our son is 33. They're both married as of the last 4 and 5 years respectively. And we have our first grandchild, a boy named Cooper, who just, he's going on 9 months old shortly. And every month is precious. I know you have two children of your
I
own.
do.
So, especially the first child is just, it's extremely exciting. And I'm happy I'm probably retiring in a couple of years. So I'll get to spend a lot of our grandson's early years, spend a lot of time with them.
And does your family live nearby you in Costa Rica, or are they elsewhere?
Our daughter and her husband actually were here for about a year and a half, but our son-in-law has a really good career in Las Vegas, and they're going to be back there starting very soon. They don't have any children yet, and our son and his wife live about a 10-minute drive from our house, which in the modern world, especially in the States, but we're not in the States, that's a blessing if the family gets along, and we do.
That's good. Where I live, a 10-minute drive is about a block away.
Right, I know. Familiar with that. Yeah.
But I think there's not much traffic in Costa Rica, as I understand.
Well,
Not
actually, in the little area where we are, there is quite a bit of traffic, much more than when we had moved here.
okay.
And so it depends where you are. But we're going to be moving to a beach area in the northwest corner of the country, which is beautiful, much more isolated, much less traffic, and looking forward to that.
That's nice. And you said you're going to be retiring. So what kind of work do you do now?
Well, I'm the risk manager for a pretty large international sports book, specifically the pro basketball department.
How long have you been doing that?
I've been doing that since 2000, we're talking 17 years now.
Long time. Okay,
Yeah.
good. Is that something I enjoy sports myself? Is that something you enjoy, sports?
Yeah, I mean, as far as playing sports, I played almost every sport growing up. I was sort of private school good, if you know that definition. So I was good at basketball, but didn't have a chance to possibly play for University of Virginia. But yeah, I enjoyed sports, and then I kind of got into betting on sports as early as my first technical bet was when I was like 10 years old. And yeah, so I
Oh,
became interested in that as well, not just the playing.
you got cut off briefly for one moment. Your first technical bet was when?
Oh, when I was 10 years old, I bet
Oh,
my mother on the Super Bowl. So now
oh, okay.
now I was hooked. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And outside of backgammon and sports, do you have any other hobbies you enjoy doing?
Yeah, well, I've still managed to play tennis. I hope,
Yeah.
knees and shoulder are intact so far, and I'm willing to replace them if necessary to sustain the sport. I may have to adapt to pickleball. That seems like the thing, especially as you get a little bit older. Just it makes some sense, but we'll see how that goes. I'm also I'm very interested. I've read it's almost like a college education worth of time that I've spent with watching and listening to interviews done with people on not so much alternate states of consciousness, but what is consciousness, and sort of both the science and the sort of the spiritual realm, either understanding or guesswork as to deeper layers of reality and things like that. I don't want to make it sound too highbrow or special, but it really fascinates me.
Right. Well, that's good. It's always good to have interest. Then you mentioned pickleball. Is that the one where it's kind of like a smaller version of tennis almost?
Yeah, the court is about a quarter of the size, and it's played. You almost only play it as a doubles game. And
Yeah.
originally it was set up for older people to play, but now people of all ages are playing, and some people make fun of the sport and say it's ridiculous. But on the other hand, it's the fastest growing quote unquote sport in the United States. So it's got some business legs and a lot of people that are really into it.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think exercise is good. And one of the things I've learned is as you get older, it's hard to do the same kinds of things you used to do when you were younger.
Yeah, so you just switch up and do more walking and swimming if you're able to do that, and just keep finding something that works.
Yeah. Good, good. Okay. Well, great. So let's talk a little bit about backgammon. Let's start by talking about how you first got into backgammon and how long you've been playing.
So I think it was about either it was 15 or 16, and my stepfather's family were into a wide range of games between playing pool and something called cribbage, that's not so many people are familiar with, but it was played a lot in the I'm sure the 40s and 50s, and I think they played bridge, or some of them did, but backgammon was the one that I played some pool, but backgammon I hadn't played it, but I instantly was drawn to it. And who knows what the combination is? It's a very aesthetic game. I guess not everyone sees it that way, but the people who are drawn to it, usually the aesthetics or something. And the dice element, I like this combination where I could sense that there was some meaningful strategy, even though I wasn't reading books, at the very beginning, I wasn't reading any books. I just sensed that I was a little bit overmatched by my stepfather's father, and but I wanted to improve. I was just I was kind of determined, and then I did it, and they live in Chicago, so we would visit. But back in New York, I got a couple of crappy, at the time, who knew, but I mean crappy backgammon books. I didn't get Magriel's book for quite a while. I don't, maybe when I was like 18 or 19. But I found that there were places to play. I also found out that this cousin of mine was a really good backgammon player, and found out he was making really good money doing it. And I was already drawn to gambling, and I was drawn to the game. And now I find out this cousin of mine is making a lot of money playing it, and that just fueled me more. It turns out that I never play with my cousin. I mean, it's sort of weird that I was interested in the game. I've got this cousin, he lives in New York, but we weren't that close. And the age difference was like 7 years. And he was a little bit arrogant. I don't think he was like a guy that really liked teaching anything. And I could have probably asked him, but I didn't. So he gave me a little advice over time, just a question here, or an observation there, but there was still an influence, even though we didn't play.
So you started playing when you were a teenager, and then I know you were playing for some time and you took a break. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So there are a couple of dimensions to this. So when I was playing in New York and kind of hanging around the clubs and watching the good players and asking an occasional question if I didn't bother them too much, I was definitely improving. I was paying my dues. I wasn't always winning for sure. First of all, it's backgammon. Second of all, you just have to pay your dues. And then I got to college, and I was playing there because backgammon was very big. I was in college starting in 1977, and that was still part of this really big era of backgammon. So I was playing poker, I was playing backgammon, and I kept improving. I got to play a guy from Long Island who was good, and learned some stuff from him, and just sort of incrementally I was improving. So I got to the point, kind of skip ahead a little bit, but in the 80s, I was in Philadelphia trading options. This is the first time that I was married, and also living we were renting in a building that had a backgammon club in the basement. Or no, I was on the first floor somewhere, which I knew. It wasn't like it was a surprise. This was intentional to be there. And I kept playing there, as well as trading options. And yeah, continue with this. The market crash in, it's 86 or 87. Now I'm like blanking out which year. I think it was 87, right? That wasn't good for the company that I was working with. I didn't own the company. These two guys, one of whom was a big backgammon player from Boston earlier, they owned it, and they took on too much risk with the volatility that went on. So that company went out of existence, and now I kind of returned with like a new intent, because I really wanted to pay bills, to play backgammon. So I started commuting to New York from Philadelphia and hanging around. This is the coterie at its height, really. I mean, this went on, I guess, for another 10 years or so. I'm not sure how long the coterie was around, but it was already around, and I was able to play and watch and talk to Sankiewicz and Magriel and Chuck Papazian and Jason Lester and Billy Horan and Mike Subodny. I mean, this is a pretty powerhouse crew. You'd be hard pressed to add more than a couple of players and say you've got the best players in the U.S. at that point. And that was a great gift. There were also, fortunately, some people that weren't that good. Otherwise, you couldn't make any money. Just paying the high fees and playing these who's who of backgammon players. But I used that time. I was making plausible money. It's inconsistent because it's backgammon. Sometimes you're on a run. Sometimes you go 2 months and you can't, and you're just treading water. But I learned a lot in a couple of ways. I was able to. Magriel and I became friendly. I'm not going to say we're close friends, but there are a lot of people in backgammon. You're backgammon friends, and that's what we were. And there was a lot of I had to sort of earn his respect to some extent. After all, he had the status, and I was just kind of coming on. But we rolled out positions, and this didn't go on all the time. But we discussed a lot of things, and that I always liked that because Paul was one of possibly the greatest teacher ever. And certainly there's some terrific teachers now that learned from Paul and learned from some other people. But he had great patience. He figured out how individual people learned. He didn't come with a set approach to things. And so I just learned a lot about backgammon from him, also about teaching because I like sharing things. And it was during that time, after a few years, I don't know the exact year, but Walter Trice is a pretty well-known name in backgammon. He contributed a lot with his boot camp book and many, many articles. I think he wrote more than one book, but he and I became very good backgammon friends. And he came up with the idea that he would create, or he felt he could create, a tool for me. So this wasn't a bot in the modern sense of you're playing against XG or you're playing against Jellyfish or Snowy to help improve your game. But this was going to assist me in rollouts because Magriel was the rollout king originally, and then Ed O'Loughlin was probably the next in line and probably has eclipsed Paul in terms of the number of rollouts he's done. But I did quite a number of rollouts because I really wanted to, understand the game and figured certain positions that I might learn quite a bit about if I just kind of kept playing them and kept understanding the nuances of what was important. So I was able, with Walter's assistance, and I paid it. It wasn't just being friendly. I paid him for this. I was able to roll out positions about 6 times faster than I had been before. So this accelerated some of my learning process. There are people that sort of assume that, oh, I had this special thing, and therefore that accounts for my rise. I think it definitely helped me. There's no question. But I was doing these truncated rollouts where I would just go maybe 3, 4, 6 rolls deep on each side, depending on the position, and I would make an assessment, a subjective assessment on what it was worth, because I don't have an XG to say it's worth 0.75, and it's my own guesswork. But that was a very valuable tool. Okay, so that was that period up to now we're extending up to the early 90s. So I actually retired in 1997, and at that point, I had ascended to a point where, between tournament wins and a perception that many people perceive, it can sound like tooting my own horn, but at least it's me 30 years ago. It's almost like a different person, that I was perceived to be the best money player in the world. Now, clearly, a couple of Subodny, there are a couple of people that are clearly making way more money than I was from the game. So depends how you want to evaluate, a great money player, right? Can you get the games? Can you, that's a big portion. Or simply, how are you if you have to play in a shootout with top players and some weaker players, or head to head against strong players? And so that was the perception. There wasn't a big sample size for anybody on, how you're playing in tournaments. All we have is the evidence of whether you're winning or losing. And so, some of the top players, I guess they figured that even if I wasn't winning quite as many tournaments as some other people were, that it seemed that I was playing them at almost the same level I was playing for money. So that's how I got that perception. Again, it's imperfect. Some of it is because people like you more than other people. Even in today's vote, there's some of that subjectivity for sure. But I reached something that I had sought out a little bit more than the money. I like paying the bills by playing backgammon, but I also sought, as you know, as anyone might, if you're within range of possibly being the best at a sport or, you know, a board game or whatever, you'd like to be the best. You'd like to be seen as the best, but you'd also like to actually be the best. And reaching that gave me a sense of confidence that extended way beyond playing backgammon. So in 1996 is, you know, basically 97 is when I remarried. And I made the decision that, you know, traveling to tournaments and that kind of lifestyle was not really going to work with being married. My wife had nothing against backgammon at all. In fact, we met through a backgammon tournament. So she understood that part of me very much. But it was harder for me to make money playing backgammon at that point, because I achieved a level that, you know, was a little intimidating to some people. They said they might wish me well, they want to have dinner with me, but they don't really want to play me. And that's, you know, that's backgammon, right? It's not poker where you can kind of sit down almost anywhere. And the stakes were also getting smaller. So unless, again, you had these connections with, you know, Russian oligarchs and the like, the regular backgammon stakes were going down from, you know, sometimes $50 a point down to 20s, or the 20s were going down to 10s. And that's, you know, really tough to make a living that way. So that's the reason I took a break. So, and then my return to the game was directly inspired by my son, John. And that happened in 2015. So we're hyperspacing. It's almost, in 2014, I played for like 5 weeks. I played against XG just because I had a break, and someone said, "Why don't you try this?" And I was bored, so I did that. But that was it. And then I said, "Okay, that was interesting," and I felt like I was playing pretty well. But in 2015, my son got interested, and I decided there was a choice. There was another, you know, family member that, you know, plays some backgammon, and we're not that close, but, you know, he could have taught my son backgammon to a certain level, maybe to a weak intermediate level, or I could. And I had this concern because we know backgammon well enough. I mean, it's a beautiful game. I think, you know, we can discuss this later. It teaches you a lot of things about that there are metaphors for life in certain ways, and certainly business life later on. But it's also pretty compulsive. Like if you're drawn to the game, you can find yourself playing, instead of playing 5 hours a week, you're suddenly playing, especially with XG and, you know, whatever, you can be playing and studying 15, 20 hours a week. And then the gambling element, and some people are really good at the game, but you throw in gambling to it. Now you get your psychology involved, and suddenly you just spend a lot of time that, especially when you're young, you know, probably should be used in other ways. So, but I felt like he was going to do this regardless. So I better be his coach, because, you know, I have the best chance of keeping it somewhat balanced. And, you know, and if he really wants to get good, you know, there's a shot that I could help him to do that.
And
So
your son was an adult at that point?
so this is 15 years ago. He was, I think he was maybe 19.
19. Yeah, I'm trying to
This,
teach
this,
my
this,
8-year-old.
Yeah, let me take that back. No, this was 8 years ago. Okay, he was 20, 24, 25. Right, it didn't
Yeah,
make
yeah.
it.
It's a
Yeah,
lot easier to teach it, you know, someone in their mid 20s. Yeah. My son's 8 and it's really hard.
yeah. Well, and the, you know, the attention span, it depends on the child.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
Yeah.
So you were teaching him.
Yeah, so I was teaching him, and in doing that, we would find some positions where we either disagreed, or I said, because he would ask me, and, you know, very often my honest answer is, I don't know. You know, I mean, there's some people, or your child could think, oh, you must know because you're so good or something. But, you know, backgammon's a very challenging game, and so we'd start to look up. We use XG to check out doubling positions and whatever. And yeah, and that helped him. That kept me honest. And yeah, and from there, I just say it was in that. So it was in 2015 that I think I started to play a little bit on Gridgammon when I was in the off season, when the NBA wasn't in action. And now is what I started to play some of the better players that were on Gridgammon back then. And and my game was pretty strong. And suddenly you develop that bug, or you can, to see, well, I'm already playing at like 3-2, and I haven't really played that much. And I want to see, and I'm asking questions, how good is the best player in the world? And, it's thought to be Mochi back then, of course, as it still is. And they said, oh, he's probably playing like 2-8 or 2-7 or something like that. And I was playing Falafel some, and so many good players. And I felt like, okay, I feel sure that I'm in the top 30 already. And yeah, and I just sort of kept grinding at it to see. It was a personal quest. Didn't matter to anyone else. That was just my son wanted me to, because he said he didn't understand how I ever retired being the best at something. So he always kind of wanted to see me um, try it again, and that was yeah, that became a motivation. Ego for sure, but.
That is good motivation. So I know you said some of the things you've done to improve your game with some of those rollouts with Walter Trice, and a little bit more recently using XG. The probably the most common question people ask, or they want me to ask in these interviews, is if there's anything else that you've done to improve your game, and how do you recommend other people to improve their game?
Well, I mean, there's some good books. I mean, some people buy every book, and I guess they're able to, derive various benefits from different authors, their presentations, uh, the particular um, the particular subject matter, because most backgammon books are not widespread. They focus on. I know you're. I've recently read, been fortunate enough to read the PDF of your own coming book on back games, which is pretty exceptional, and I highly recommend when it's released that people buy that.
Thank
But
you.
but then there's Roberti's on the other side with 501 problems that I mean, he's written many books, but that was the first book that I got of his, and that was very wide ranging and terrific. Even if the first edition had many problems that turn out to be relatively small errors, it's not the point, and all that was cleaned up with a future edition. So certain books, it depends where you are in your game. Certainly if you're just starting out, Magriel's book is almost a little too advanced for people who are starting out, but it has sections which are kind of develop. If you're going to have an appetite and you're a little bit intellectually oriented, even as a kid, the ideas presented, I think it's very good, and you can keep revisiting that book at every stage of your game. It's just a beautiful book that way. I haven't read tons of books. I mean, I focused in, again, I mentioned Roberti's. I did read Walter Trice's Boot Camp, but that was actually more recently than when it was actually coming out, because it came out when I was on my long hiatus anyhow. And yeah, Magriel's book. I've read Mark Olson's written some terrific books by all accounts.
Yes.
The one, yeah, I'm just trying to get back to my list here. The one, yeah, I read Pure Strategy,
That's a
and
good
I
one.
I enjoy that quite a bit. Michi's book on, I think it's Endgame Techniques. Is that what it's called?
He has endgame techniques, opening concepts was the first one, endgame was the second one, and back
Yeah,
check strategy is the third one. And I
right.
understand he's working on another book about the 5 point match, which his books are outstanding too. They're easy to read.
Yeah, yeah. They're very, I mean, I only have read Endgame Techniques, which I like quite a bit. The style of writing is very friendly, and the descriptions are very accessible. I find the examples are really good. So yeah, I'm a big, even though I've only read one so far, everyone loves his books. So
Oh yeah,
and
I'd recommend you read the other ones. I mean, his books are outstanding in terms of other endgame books. I'm sure you're familiar with Bob Wachtel's.
I've read one of his as well, and I
That's more
complimented Bob
technical.
on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it is. But niche books are fine. It depends, especially if your game is already really strong. You're looking for the areas that you haven't spent much time on. So that's really good. Dirk's book, The Theory of Backgammon, is outstanding. It's yeah, it's a very particular book. So it's the best of its kind. in my opinion, by far, as far as the math of the game and discussing concepts like cube efficiency in terms of match score, in terms of some of the checker play is influenced by, how this cube efficiency is likely to play out. Brilliantly, carefully written, and is so impressive. There's a lot of math involved. So if people are, it's obviously we play a very mathematical game, but some people are more mathematically oriented than others. And if you're not that mathematically oriented, you might save that book. And I know the book that Mochi and Mark just came out with
Yeah.
has been already, had rave reviews, and I'm going to get to that. I can't comment on it yet because I haven't read it, but I'm sure it's terrific.
It's outstanding. I read it and I actually proofread it, and I read all the. I'll tell you about all the other books that I've recently read when you're done.
Okay. No, I think that's it on the book section. And as far as my use of XG is probably slightly different than most people. I can't. I know some people that use it a lot and they use it in certain ways. Some people play a tremendous amount against XG, both because they feel like, well, that's the toughest opponent that they'll have, and they also get quick feedback on what they're doing. So it's understandable that's interesting. I would rather play people for sure, but I'm in a remote area, and many people are in remote places where they don't have the opportunity to play people live that often. So it's wonderful in that way. The 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 way that I often use it, though, in playing regular money games or playing matches against people, whether it's on Galaxy or Gridgammon or Heroes, I'll tend to go through my play in batches, which is not that common for people. But what I'll do is, let's say I'll review 10 matches at once. Instead of reading and reviewing each match as it comes up, I want to get perspective in a decent sample size of themes that maybe I'm off on. Am I doubling too early? Am I taking too many questionable takes? Am I hitting too much or hitting too little? They're themes. Everyone has their themes, and some of them are the same themes as other people have. But I want to get a lot of information at the same time. Because occasionally you play a match and it's just like extremely difficult. You have back games or whatever, where you're tired and you're just making all sorts of mistakes. And you have to, it's almost like people who bet on horse racing, that they know that there's certain horses that if it was raining and it's like it's a muddy track, but they still run these races, that you very often just discard those races as far as good evidence. Maybe it's good evidence that a horse is particularly good or bad if it's raining, but by and large, most of the time you're running on a decent surface. So you just kind of throw those out. It's the same with backgammon matches. So, you can get fixated on how horribly you play this match, or, but sometimes you get too locked into this one event and beat up on yourself.
Yeah, I think it's good to categorize your errors, and one of the things I'm working with some people on developing some new software that's able to do that for you, which is good. And then in terms of learning from XG, I think that's outstanding. And reading the books, there have been actually a number of outstanding books recently in the past 5 to 10 years. I know you mentioned Bill Roberti, who's written many books. I just got the third volume of his recent series, How to Play the Opening in Backgammon. That one's outstanding. I know you mentioned the Michi's book, Mark Olson and Mochi with Alec Barr. The Backgammon Masterclass is an outstanding book. I just read the one by Francois Tardieu, Strategic Concepts, which is outstanding. I also read Zdenek Ziska's The Ziska Method, Holding Game Guru by Stick Rice, Adjusting to Match Play by Nick Blazier. I'm sure I'm missing some more, but those are
Yeah, that's
the
that's
recent
that.
ones.
Yeah, that's pretty complete, and it's excellent. It's a variety of authors coming with their own angles, or particular ways of writing as well, because it's having a variety of metaphors. Or in the case of Zdenek, I love the fact, and he does something that's very familiar to me. He talks about storylines. and that, if you can create a, what's going on here, and that changes in backgammon very rapidly at times. But in the moment, you have to decide, what's going on here, what's likely to be happening in the next two rolls, what's the nature of this position, and then if you can do that, it's one thing to ask the question, another thing to understand how to solve that, and really create the appropriate story. But that's just one example of many. People have it maybe in many different words. They're also talking about storylines, but I think Zdenek was the first one to really use that.
Yeah, and he talks about looking forward. I know there have been a number of books talking about the early game and opening plays. And I don't know if you're aware, I wrote a book on opening strategies that hasn't really been formally published because I said there's so many of them. But that's kind of why I chose the topic of the back games, which you mentioned, because there hasn't been much written about that. So I did something a little bit more comprehensive. But in terms of back games, Mochi has an outstanding chapter in his book, and so does Francois Tardieu.
Mhm.
And Bill Roberti has a good section in one of his books, and Walter Trice as well. But
Right.
other than that, there's not a lot. So hopefully it'll be nice to have something on a different topic. So nowadays, how much time do you spend playing backgammon every week?
Well, yeah, so backgammon is a combination for me and and some other players. Some people just play, like they either play or that's it. I think many people do some kind of hybrid between playing and studying, and very often the ratio is pretty steep, where you're playing whatever 12 hours and you're studying 3 hours, reviewing your stuff. It doesn't mean you're reading books all the time, but just reviewing your play. In my own case, when I came back to the game, so starting in, let's say, 2015, there'd be long stretches where I wouldn't play very much, because I was working, and so my play was heavily weighted toward the months between, let's say, late June and early September. But if you just average it all out, I was probably playing and studying about 15 hours a week. Which is, I'm not a professional player anymore. I have a career and a family. So 15 hours a week is like, for a hobby it's quite a bit. But
Wow.
of course I got interested in the game again. I'm playing and practicing with my son, and then I got into playing on Gridgammon and so on. And it kind of sustained at about 15 hours a week from 2015 to 2018. And then I accelerated a little bit in 2019. This is the first time I got on these Facebook forums and start to see, a whole range of positions. I mean, some of them are relatively easy and some of them are quite difficult. Some of them are difficult but generic, like, you really want to know this. Some of them are just like insanely difficult and rarely come up. But it's a hodgepodge of things. And I started to, I like quizzing myself. I love taking backgammon quizzes. I think I'm sort of a test taker by nature. I suspect you
Oh,
are as
and I
well.
forgot I forgot to mention you actually won the Super Genius Quiz book by James Vogel. I was going to include that in the introduction, but he made a whole book about 100 quiz problems, and you ranked top out of a number of the top players in the world.
Yeah, that was a pretty cool experience. So James created 100 problems in 10 different categories, and we were all there. It was Mochi and Dirk and Sander and Joe Russell, and I don't want to leave anyone out. I'm not going to try to remember all the names, but I think there were 12 of us, and it was all done by Zoom. So we're all in our little boxes, and he starts the clock and tells us when that section is over, and we kind of went through it like that. So yeah, I prevailed by like I think there's like either two or three questions over. Zdenek finished second, as I recall. And just quizzes come, I don't know, very very naturally to me. We're all like, all the elite players are good test takers. I mean, it's not about that. And there was some luck involved, because there's some of them that were decided by zero point zero 0.02, and I could have easily guessed something else or been wrong by 0.02. But that was nice, and there was actually a payday, because James was creating this book, and he was offering $5,000 to the winner, and you didn't have to post up any money, and so
Wow, that's great.
yeah.
He put up the money himself.
He did. He did. Yeah,
Wow.
he took some estimate. Well, this was going to be a valuable part of his book, and he also asked. You didn't have to sign something in blood to say you would do this, but he asked that the participants would assist him with making some comments on the questions. Whether they got it right or wrong. And that would be helpful. So, I did my part. I know Mochi wrote quite a bit. And, there's several players that contribute something in that effort. It's a very good book.
It
It's
is. That's one of the newer ones that I didn't mention, and it's a very good book. It's very unique in that it does have the commentary from so many outstanding players, so you can learn a lot from that one.
yeah.
Yeah, so that's good. I mean, I like those online forums a lot. You see a lot of people talking about it, and you meet some interesting characters as well.
Yeah, at least what one comes to mind. Well, I was going to say I did. So I started participating in these and lending my thoughts where I could. And I've noticed, and some other people have noticed, and I'm not going to name any names. But, it seemed like there are a couple of players who are like very good players, but they seem to like never get any answers wrong when they participate in these things. It's not like they answer all the time, but they just never get anything wrong. I get because I used to go back through and kind of like I keep statistics on all sorts of things. It's just my nature, and I get about 30% of them wrong, and, which is fine because a lot of the and we're talking about the tougher problems. I'm not talking about the ones that are just, a beginner sent something in. But yeah, I learn. I hopefully help, some other people learn a bit with some of my comments that are right. And even some of the comments that are wrong. I think, incorrect comments that are at least thoroughly laid out. It's like a lawyer, this is
Right.
this is the case that I'm making, and you're not always right. Or the judge says, it's like, no, we're not accepting that. So that's been a nice process, and I don't think anyone's going to go back and weed through all the positions, all the comments that I've made. I'm sure there's like a book or two worth in terms of length, not in terms of I don't know how to organize it or anything else, but everyone says, well, you've never written a book and you're going to write a book. I've sort of written one on Facebook in
Yeah,
a different way of going about it. But
it's
I do have the intention of writing a book one day. I'm likely to retire in 2 years, and there's one book that hasn't been written yet. But you never know; people are writing so quickly. By the time I get to it, maybe it's written on the psychology of backgammon.
that would be great.
And there have been, I think Dirk wrote a little bit in his book. I mean, here and there, there's some comments on, how to play against your opponent and things like that. But my idea is not simply to talk about how to read your opponent or test them out in matches to get a an idea of their take or pass range and that sort of thing, but it's also your own psychology. And this goes back to, I think it was Socrates that said, know thyself is like one of these first principles. And I don't think, I'm not going to write a book of, this is how to solve, your psychological issues per se, but it's how to understand. If you understand yourself to some extent, I'm a very aggressive person by nature. I'm a kind of passive person by nature. Whatever it is, I mean, those are the standard extremes. But there can be other elements too. How do I play under pressure? How do I make decisions under pressure in my life? And the more you understand that, the more you can set kind of internal guardrails while you're playing to sort of manage that. So I know I'm very aggressive, but I also know that at least XG tells me that I'm being too aggressive. And so when you're not sure, it's probably the case that the aggressive person should make the passive decision. They shouldn't double, they should pass, they shouldn't hit, different things like that. So it's not going to be a long book. I don't anticipate writing 200 pages on this, but, it might be, 100 pages. So,
I think that would be a very interesting and very unique book, especially because there are a lot of people that are different. They have different playing styles. You see some of these people that don't even believe what the computer says. You see those people, and it's like, how do you explain things to them?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know. Some people have no sympathy for the people that feel that way. I guess I have, I'm very oriented, of course, to modern backgammon and the use of XG and so on. But in some ways, I'm a little nostalgic for the time where we just didn't know, and we had to try to just use our wits and our time to maybe roll out some things and whatever, and take some risk in playing propositions and to figure things out. I mean, there was something that's that day is gone, but that day had its appeal in some ways too.
Well, nowadays I know a lot of people will do that. They'll do prop bets on a position, and instead of rolling it out, they'll just bet, and then they'll put the position into XG and get the result, and they have quicker bets.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah. I mean, the old days had its appeal. Certainly, if you were better than your opponent and understood a position better, yeah, you'd rather roll it out because you'd get these sort of wide swings, and and people still wouldn't know what was going on. They think they were being unlucky, or it's just like, and sometimes no one knew. Even the expert was actually wrong sometimes. But yeah, there's a lot more gamble to it for sure.
Nowadays you have people talking about the orchestrated dice and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, I'm a pretty big skeptic, although I do know someone that I respect a lot who doesn't participate on these forums and say wild ass things, who's a little suspect as well in the case of one of the playing sites, and not saying it's intentional, but just saying he's tested stuff out so much, and he would make actual serious bets on some of this. So I'll leave that as a side subject. We're not going to return to it. I'm not mentioning names.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I talk
yeah.
to people too, and they say the same kinds of things. But there's a lot, you learn about risk and reward when you're studying, when you're playing, and I think you could learn a lot of things about life when you're playing backgammon. What are the things that you think people can learn in terms of their everyday life when they play?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, backgammon involves certainly as you come to really appreciate the game, whether you become a top level player or not, the adjustments that you have to make, and you understand these easier if you're playing again. You have a good teacher. They can tell you that these adjustments they're happening. You may not recognize them, but the more experience you have and the more you're being explained that what you were focusing on 2 roles ago is no longer applicable, that the situation and life is shifting under your feet, in the modern world way more than it used to. There are just so many variables, between, you have a job one day and now you're having to move, to another state in another division. And, there are economic issues for sure. Relationships are very often, for better or for worse, are much shorter than they used to be. I mean, until people get married, there's a lot of that. And world events. There's just so many variables. I mean, health is always, a possibility as well. But I think the having to make all these adjustments, and just a sense of risk reward, whether you get deep into the probabilities or not. I think a probabilistic sense of life. Everything is not solved by equations. Our emotions matter and all these things. But in terms of a lot of very practical aspects of life, kind of having a feel of what the math is and making certain kinds of decisions can be really helpful.
Yeah, I think that can be very useful to people, and it's a great thing to teach people as children to start playing these kinds of games, whether it's backgammon or other types of games. Chess is more popular, but backgammon's popular in certain countries like Denmark. And I know back when you started, backgammon was very popular in the 70s and 80s, and then it kind of died down a little bit, but hopefully we're getting some more people in it. What are your thoughts as to how we can get more people involved in the game of backgammon?
Well, I mean, I think a fairly good job is being done. It's incremental. It's just not going to happen all at once, but if it's going to happen, it needs to keep building. It needs to have momentum. As we discussed at another time, this question of, backgammon has gone through many different waves. It's gone through surges of interest, especially in the United States. I think in the Middle East, it's probably remained, my senses has been kind of a constant for, a couple of thousand years. But in the United States, there's been 3 or 4 different waves, and it tends to sort of, build up and then crest. And in the States, as opposed to, let's say, Japan in particular, there still aren't that many young people in the game. And I know Joe Russell and so many other people have tried to help with, interest in, a collegiate, zone of promoting backgammon and showing that it's not simply a wild ass gambling game, but, has some other benefits. Yeah, I think, Mark Olson certainly, and his team are just doing a tremendous job. I think, they're the streaming, it's, I mean, there was some streaming, I guess, in the past, but now there's so much streaming, and the ones that are coming from the premier tournaments are really high quality. Both in terms of the visuals and the quality of the commentators that they get, and that helps, because I think the more backgammon is seen, it's just like poker. I mean, backgammon is a tricky game compared to poker as far as, having it be on ESPN, and there are different reasons for that. But the more exposure it gets, as the visual aspect and being explained kind of what's going on and what these players are thinking, and highlighting the top players in the game, that tends to have a promotional aspect that starts to draw more players over time. What the Japanese have done, I mean, particularly Mochi and Michi and several others over there, they've created a backgammon culture where backgammon is viewed, along with Go and chess and the Chinese version of chess and everything. It's being perceived as an elite game. It may not be ranked quite as highly as those other 3, but it's not being placed, in an area where it's just some dice game. It has a cultural cache now. And they're creating, they have lots of young students, and I think it's terrific what they're doing. I don't know that can be so easily replicated in other countries, though. I'll say that. I think part of it is, and I'm not claiming to know so much about the Japanese culture, but I think it's more likely that could work in that particular culture than it can in some. In the United States, for instance, you just compare levels of patience, or the constancy of focus of younger people, and those are very different in the 2 cultures.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so that's a lot. Yeah, I talked to Mochi about that kind of stuff. He's developed that, and with a lot of people. Oh, that's your dog. That's okay. I'll keep going.
So hold on just 1 second. I think I can shut them up. Hold on.
Yeah, yeah. I'll keep going while you're away, but I think, Backgammon Galaxy does an outstanding job. Also Terria Peterson of Backgammon Heroes, he runs an outstanding website. Getting people involved and playing online is outstanding. And a lot of the streaming ones, that's a focus that I've been working on. Backgammon Galaxy does some outstanding work. So I would recommend going and watching their videos. Those are outstanding. Other ones include Bill Riles from Ace Point Backgammon. He just does a tremendous job, very high quality work. And Mate Ferrer from Backgammon News. I'm telling people about the other videos that people do. Mate Ferrer, Backgammon News. He does an outstanding job, as does Dmitry Obakov. He works with the BMAB, the World Backgammon Federation. I know Roberto Litzenberger does a lot with the Backgammon Cafe. Michi does a lot on his. So there are a lot of channels out there on YouTube, including mine. I mean, I do a lot of the interviews, but I do some commentary on matches and various other things. So I think those are great ways of expanding the game as well.
Yeah, those are definitely helpful, and that's going on more frequently. I mean, I think many of those, of course, are hitting intermediates on up. I mean, I'm not sure. I don't know how those audiences break down. Maybe a couple of them are fine as well for players just starting to play. But the question of growing the game, it's one I think those are good for this question of backgammon goes in waves. that the more information there is from a variety of people on their own flavors and personalities or something, the more it can sustain some of the people who have been playing for a couple of years and their interest maybe is sliding, or it's sort of plateauing, but then they have these different new sources to kind of keep increase their understanding in an entertaining way, let's say.
Yeah. So good. And then there were maybe just a couple of other things that were on the list. I know you don't go to many tournaments nowadays, but there are a few that you go to. I know you like to go to Monte Carlo.
Yeah, it's not simply that I do, and I go with my wife, and one year my brother and his wife and our children went with us, and yeah, it's a one of a kind event and location, but it also has fit my schedule. So it isn't that, it sounds kind of arrogant. Yes, I'll only go to Monte Carlo. That's not the case. I'd
Right.
intended to go to Carol Cole's tournament in
Oh
Michigan
yeah.
3 years ago, but I went actually. I was physically on location, but I got really sick. This is pre-COVID, but I wasn't able to participate. But so they're definitely, as I said, I plan to retire in a couple of years, and there are many tournaments, and not in any particular order, but Cyprus is one. This in Dubai now has one, and we haven't been there. And most of these I'd like to go with my wife at least the first time because we love traveling together. Also the one in Turkey. We'd like to go to Japan anyhow, and I know they have a good tournament over there. And back in the States, it's like, well, I haven't played in a tournament. I'm going to actually play my first tournament in the States, given that I miss Michigan. So it's my first tournament in the States in 27 years.
Wow.
Is gonna be in New York in this coming January. So
Oh,
uh,
good. Were you gonna
yeah.
go to Las Vegas?
Yeah, I'm not. This is just I'm making an exception to my no backgammon tournaments during the NBA season. Uh, my- and well, and my mother's, she's not a young woman, and I'd like to be able to, I hopefully should be able to come to the tournament for part of a day, or I'd kind of like that to happen.
She's still in
Um,
New York.
she is, she is, yeah. So I see her usually once a year, and
That's
uh,
nice.
yeah.
Well, I think we talked about a lot of different things, and I really enjoyed speaking with you and learned a lot. Are there any other things that you wanted to talk about?
I don't think so. I mean, I was going to sort of like a shout out to some of the young stars of the game, and
Yes,
and that
please.
and I think having young stars, that's another thing that fuels, other young people to get into the game, because if it's perceived as it once was, we've gone through stages again. The Scandinavians, and still, but I mean, they had a strong wave starting in the 90s, where a lot of the guys in their 20s were starting to ascend very quickly. And now that the Japanese are doing that, but it's not only from Japan. We have Zdenek, from Czech Republic. Is it Czech Republic? If I'm
Czech
saying that right.
Republic. Yeah.
Right. Okay. We have Ryan Rebello from Canada. And I'm trying to think if I leave
Mislav
any.
Kovacic from Croatia or something, I believe.
That's right. We also have Joe Bernaba, who's Tony Bernaba's son, is an excellent player. He hasn't played in many tournaments yet, but he's maybe 17 or 18 or something. He's also terrific. So it's not simply the Japanese don't have the market cornered on the young players ascending, and yeah, like I said, I think that's going to inspire some other players, who know them or from those countries or something to come on board.
Yeah, that's outstanding. Hopefully, we can get more young players. And remember, you mentioned about the college stuff. I actually worked with Joe Russell and some other people to start a club at UCLA here in Los Angeles. So those are all great things. Any final remarks you want to include? I'm sure we can certainly talk more in other videos. I'd love to have you again. But do you have any final remarks for today's interview?
No, I think that's a good wrap, and I know I don't know if you were going to mention this, but I think maybe sometime in the next week or two we're going to play 3 to 5 DMP matches, or I'm going to play against XG, and then we'll discuss the plays, and we'll save that for a separate time.
Yes, I think I was doing with the interviews, doing some position analysis with the guests, but I think this is an even better idea to do it on a separate video and go through a whole just DMP match as opposed to a full long match because that could go on for a long time. But you could do a DMP match, and if it's short in time, you can do multiple in like a 30-minute segment, and that would
Yeah,
be great. Other things that I'm doing is commentary on some matches, and I'd love to have you as a guest there too. And I look forward to those more videos with you and others.
great. Alex, you're doing what you're doing is a great service to the game. I know you enjoy it, but I can tell that, which also it makes it even better, the fact that you're clearly very engaged and interested in helping the game and learning more yourself. And so it's been very nice to meet you.
Yeah, great. Likewise, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope the viewers have enjoyed this video. Please do like and subscribe, and you'll be notified every time I upload a new video. Please let me know what you think in the comments below, what you'd like to see in future videos. If you have any comments for Wilcox about the video, hopefully we can start a chat there or elsewhere. I look forward to seeing all the viewers in upcoming videos. And until then, keep rolling your dice.